A 6-year-old war refugee in a wheelchair rolled through an Alaskan parking lot, handed a note to the most dangerous-looking man in Anchorage, and whispered, "Can you sit next to me at lunch? If you are there, they won't call me monster." Before we get into Celeste's incredible journey, I want to know, where are you watching this from right now? Drop your city in the comments below. Hit that subscribe button right now. Now let's get into the story. The wind in Anchorage doesn't just bite, it punishes. At -12 degrees, it cuts through winter coats like they're made of tissue paper, freezes tears before they can fall, and turns every breath into a visible ghost. But 6-year-old Celeste barely noticed the cold anymore. She'd survived worse than Alaska's winter. She'd survived a war. Her wheelchair's rubber grips were frozen solid as she tried to push herself across the icy parking lot of Moose's Diner on Northern Lights Boulevard. The wheels kept catching in the slush, spinning uselessly, and her one arm, her only arm, was already burning with exhaustion. She'd been out here for 20 minutes, trying to make it from the bus stop to the diner's entrance, a distance most people covered in 30 seconds. Nobody stopped to help. Cars pulled in and out, drivers glancing at her through fogged windows before looking away. That's what people did when they saw Celeste. They looked away, because looking at her meant seeing the jagged scar that ran from her left temple down to her jaw, a souvenir from the bombing that killed her parents. It meant seeing the empty left sleeve of her pink winter coat pinned up because there was nothing to fill it. It meant acknowledging that wars don't just happen on TV, they happen to real children, who then end up in American elementary schools, trying to figure out how to open a milk carton with one hand. Celeste had been in Anchorage for 8 months, living with her Aunt Miriam in a cramped apartment in Mountain View. Miriam worked 2 jobs and spoke broken English, which meant Celeste navigated most of her new American life alone. The social workers had promised her a motorized wheelchair, but the paperwork was still processing. Everything in America seemed to require paperwork. She finally made it to the diner's wheelchair ramp, installed after some lawsuit years ago, Miriam had said, and pushed through the front door. The warmth hit her like a wall, and for a moment she just sat there, letting the feeling return to her fingers. Her finger. Singular. She had to remember that now. The diner smelled like coffee and grease and something sweet she couldn't identify. Pie, maybe. The few customers inside glanced at her, did the usual double-take at her scars, then returned to their meals. Celeste was used to that too. At least adults didn't point and whisper like the kids at Glacier Elementary did. She wheeled herself to the counter where Miriam was waiting with a to-go bag. Her aunt's eyes were tired, dark, circles, permanent fixtures beneath them. "You shouldn't come here after school," Miriam said in their native language, handing her a burger. "It's too far, too cold." "I wanted to see you," Celeste said quietly. The truth was more complicated. She'd wanted to delay going home because home meant being alone, and being alone meant thinking about the things she tried not to think about. The sound of the explosion, her mother's scream, waking up in a field hospital without her arm. "Go home before dark," Miriam said, kissing her forehead. "Be safe." Celeste nodded and turned her wheelchair back toward the door, the warm burger in her lap. That's when she saw them through the window. 3 massive motorcycles pulling into the parking lot, chrome gleaming even in the gray Alaskan afternoon. The sound of their engines was like thunder, deep and powerful, and somehow comforting. She'd seen motorcycles before, but never this close. Never in Anchorage. The riders killed their engines and dismounted, all wearing black leather vests covered in patches she couldn't read from this distance. But she could read their body language. They moved like soldiers, like the men who'd pulled her from the rubble, like they were strong. The biggest one, a mountain of a man with a thick black beard and tattoos crawling up his neck, pulled off his helmet and shook out his hair. He was scary. Celeste could tell that immediately. His face was hard, his eyes were dark, and when he walked, people moved out of his way. Even the two men with him, both large and intimidating themselves, seemed to orbit around him like he was the sun. Celeste watched him through the window, her heart beating faster. An idea was forming in her mind, dangerous and desperate and probably stupid. But she'd learned something in her 6 years of life, something the bombing had taught her. Sometimes you had to be brave when you were terrified, or you'd never survive. She pushed her wheelchair back outside into the cold. The three bikers were walking toward the diner entrance when they saw her. The big one stopped first, his expression shifting from neutral to confused, as this tiny girl in a wheelchair rolled directly into his path. Up close he was even more intimidating, 6'4" at least, with scars on his knuckles and a presence that made the air feel heavier. Celeste looked up at him, her neck craning back. She could see the patches on his vest now. Hell's Angels, Anchorage, President. She didn't know what those words meant, but she understood hierarchy. This man was a leader. "Excuse me," she said, her accented English small against the wind. "Are you scary?" The biker's face registered a complete surprise. Behind him, the other two men stopped walking. One of them, a younger guy with red hair, looked like he might laugh, but something in the moment stopped him. "Some folks think so, sweetheart," the big man said, his voice like gravel. He crouched down to her level, and she could see his eyes were actually kind beneath the intimidating exterior. "Why do you ask?" Celeste's hand was shaking, not from the cold this time, as she reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. She'd drawn it in class during free time, when the other kids were playing and she was sitting alone. A simple flower in crayon, and beneath it, words she'd practiced writing in English for an hour. She held it out to him with her one hand. The biker took it carefully, like it might break, and unfolded it. His eyes scanned the page, and Celeste watched his expression change. His jaw tightened. His knuckles went white around the paper. Behind him, the red-haired biker leaned in to read over his shoulder and immediately looked away, his hand covering his mouth. The note read, "Can you sit next to me at lunch? If you are there, they won't call me monster." When the big biker looked back at Celeste, his eyes were wet. "Who calls you that?" "The kids at school," Celeste said simply. "Because I look like this." She gestured to her face, to her missing arm, to all the broken parts of her. "They say monsters aren't real, but I am real, so I must be a monster. But if a big scary monster is my friend, maybe they'll stop." The biker was quiet for so long that Celeste thought maybe she'd made a mistake. Maybe American bikers didn't help little girls. Maybe she'd misread everything. Then he folded the note carefully, tucked it into his vest pocket right over his heart, and looked at her with an intensity that made her feel seen for the first time since the bombing. "What's your name, darling?" "Celeste." "Celeste. I'm Johnny. And you're not a monster. You're the bravest little girl I've ever met." He stood up to his full height, and suddenly he wasn't crouching anymore. He was towering, and the anger radiating off him could have melted the snow. "Which school?" "Glacier Elementary." Johnny looked at his two brothers. "Call church. We ride tomorrow." The kids at Glacier Elementary had a game they played with Celeste, and it had rules. Rule 1, never touch her directly. That's how you'd catch whatever made her look like that. Rule 2, make sure Mrs. Patterson wasn't watching, because she'd give you that disappointed teacher look and maybe a lunch detention. Rule 3, Kyle Henderson got to go first, always, because his dad owned the biggest car dealership in Anchorage, and that meant something, even in third grade. Kyle was 9 years old and already understood power. He understood that some kids were born with it and others weren't, and Celeste definitely wasn't. She'd rolled into Glacier Elementary back in September with her broken English and her empty sleeve and those scars that made even adults flinch, and Kyle had known immediately. She was prey. It started small. Whispers during reading time. Monster coughed into hands during math, but it escalated the way cruelty always does when nobody stops it. By October, Kyle and his friends had perfected the routine. They'd wait until Celeste was struggling with her wheelchair, which was often, because the school's old building wasn't exactly ADA compliant, and they'd surround her like wolves circling wounded prey. "Need help, monster?" Kyle would ask, his voice dripping with fake concern. "Oh, wait, you only got one arm. Guess you can't even push yourself, huh?" His friends would laugh. Always the same friends. Brandon Kowalski, whose mom was on the PTA. Emma Sutton, who got straight A's and smiled while she participated. Marcus Chen, who was small for his age and grateful not to be the target. They'd circle Celeste's wheelchair, making monster noises, reaching out like they might touch her scars, and then pulling back with exaggerated disgust. Celeste never cried during these moments. She'd learned in the refugee camp that crying made things worse. She'd sit perfectly still in her wheelchair, staring straight ahead, waiting for it to end. Sometimes it took 5 minutes, sometimes 15. Depended on Kyle's mood. The teachers noticed, of course. How could they not? But Glacier Elementary had a problem, and that problem was that Celeste didn't quite fit into anyone's neat little box. She wasn't quite disabled enough for special ed. Her mind was sharp, her grades decent despite the language barrier. She wasn't quite American enough for the regular kids to relate to, and she definitely wasn't white enough for certain parents to care when their children made her life hell. Mrs. Patterson, the third-grade teacher, had pulled Kyle aside twice. Both times he'd apologized with those big innocent eyes that worked on every adult, and both times he was back at it within a week. The principal, Mr. Vickers, had even called Celeste's Aunt Miriam in for a meeting, but Miriam's English wasn't good enough to fully advocate, and the school's translator was only available Tuesdays and Thursdays. The meeting ended with Vickers suggesting maybe Celeste would be more comfortable in a school with more resources for students like her. Translation: go be broken somewhere else. The worst part wasn't even the bullying itself. The worst part was lunch. Because lunch at Glacier Elementary happened in a cafeteria with long tables that sat 12 kids each, and there was an unspoken social hierarchy to where you sat. The popular kids claimed the tables near the windows. The nerds took the ones by the teachers. The athletic kids spread out in the middle. And Celeste? She sat alone at a table in the back corner next to the emergency exit and the janitor's closet. Every single day. She'd wheel herself to that table, carefully balance her lunch tray on her lap, a skill that had taken her 2 months to master, and eat as quickly as possible while trying not to make eye contact with anyone. The cafeteria ladies felt sorry for her. You could see it in their eyes when they served her the pizza or the chicken nuggets or whatever processed food the Anchorage school district was serving that day. But pity doesn't sit with you at lunch. Pity doesn't make the other kids stop pointing. Yesterday had been particularly bad. Kyle had walked past her table, made eye contact, and then loudly asked his friends, "Yo, why does the monster eat alone?" Is it contagious?" The entire cafeteria had laughed. Not just his friends, everyone. Even kids who'd never spoken to Celeste, who had no reason to hate her, laughed because it was easier than standing up. That's when Celeste realized something that most 6-year-olds shouldn't have to understand. The world runs on fear. The kids feared being associated with her. The teachers feared angry parents. Everyone feared standing out, being different, losing their place in the comfortable American hierarchy where everyone knows their role. But Celeste had also learned something else from surviving a bombing. Sometimes fear could be a weapon. If everyone was so scared of being seen with the monster, maybe what she needed was to be seen with someone even scarier. Someone so intimidating that being near Celeste became the safe choice, not the dangerous one. That's why she'd drawn the flower. That's why she'd written the note. That's why she'd rolled her wheelchair into that parking lot and handed her desperate plea to a man who looked like he could break the world in half. Because sometimes the only way to stop being the monster is to bring a bigger monster to your side. Johnny Reaper Kern hadn't cried in 17 years. The last time was in a VA hospital in Seattle after his 3rd back surgery, when the doctor told him he'd never walk without a limp again, and his career in the Army was over. He'd been 28 then, angry at the world, bitter about the IED that had shattered his spine in Kandahar, and the government that sent him home with a Purple Heart and a prescription for OxyContin. The Hells Angels had saved his life after that. Gave him purpose, brotherhood, a reason to wake up every morning in Anchorage, Alaska, a city most people only knew as a layover between the continental United States and Asia. He'd worked his way up from prospect to full patch to sergeant at arms, and finally, 5 years ago, to president of the Anchorage chapter. At 45 years old, Johnny Kern was respected, feared, and in control. Until a 6-year-old girl in a wheelchair handed him a piece of paper that shattered every piece of armor he'd built around his heart. He'd read that note 4 times in the diner parking lot, and each time it hit harder. "If you are there, they won't call me monster." The handwriting was shaky but careful, the kind of careful that meant she'd practiced. The flower drawing was crude but sweet, and the request itself was so devastating in its simplicity that Johnny felt something inside his chest crack wide open. He knew what it felt like to be called a monster. He'd been hearing it his whole life. Monster because of the tattoos crawling up his neck. Monster because of the Hells Angels patch on his back. Monster because he'd killed men in Afghanistan and didn't lose sleep over it. Society looked at Johnny Kern and saw danger, and he'd learned to wear that reputation like armor. But this little girl, this refugee who'd survived a war and lost her arm and somehow ended up in the coldest corner of America, she thought being called monster was something shameful, something to escape from. And the fact that she believed associating with him, the actual monster, might save her from that label, that broke him. "Call everyone," Johnny said to his VP, a red-headed former Marine named Tucker Torch Riley. "I want every member of this chapter at the clubhouse in 1 hour." "Boss, what's going on?" Johnny showed him the note. Torch read it once, then read it again, and his expression went from confused to furious. "She's 6? 6 years old. War refugee. Missing an arm. Getting bullied at Glacier Elementary by American kids who think she's different." Johnny's voice was shaking with rage. "We fought in Afghanistan to protect kids like her from exactly the kind of hell she escaped. And she makes it to Alaska. Alaska, for fuck's sake. American soil. And we're letting other kids torture her? Nah. Not on my watch." The third biker, a massive Samoan named Koa who went by Tiny because bikers have a sense of humor, cracked his knuckles. What's the play? We're going to school, Johnny said. We're going to sit with her at lunch. And we're going to make damn sure every kid in that building understands that Celeste is under the protection of the Hells Angels Motorcycle Club, Anchorage chapter. Mess with her, you mess with us, Torch grinned. When do we ride? Tomorrow, noon, full colors, every bike we got. Johnny looked down at the note one more time, at the crayon flower this brave little girl had drawn for him. And Torch, bring your daughters. I want those kids to see that bikers aren't monsters. We're fathers. We're Americans, and we protect our own. An hour later, the Anchorage Hells Angels clubhouse was packed. The building was a converted warehouse in the industrial district near Ship Creek, decorated with American flags, military memorabilia, and enough Harley-Davidson chrome to blind someone. 53 full-patch members stood in the main room, plus a dozen prospects and hang-arounds. The youngest was 22. The oldest was 71, a Vietnam vet named Gus, who'd been riding since before Johnny was born. Johnny stood at the front, holding Celeste's note. "Brothers, we got a situation." The room went quiet. Church, the formal club meeting, was sacred. When the president called church, you listened. Johnny told them everything. About Celeste in the parking lot, about the wheelchair and the missing arm and the scars, about the bullying and the loneliness, and the note that asked for something so simple it made your heart hurt. Someone to sit with at lunch. When he finished, the room was silent for exactly 3 seconds. Then Gus, the Vietnam vet, stood up. His voice was rough from 50 years of cigarettes and screaming over Harley engines. "I got shrapnel in my leg from a Viet Cong grenade. Couldn't walk right for years. Kids used to call me Gimpy when I came home. Made me want to put a bullet in my brain." He looked around the room. "Any man here who thinks we shouldn't ride for this girl can fight me right now. I'll beat your ass with my cane." Nobody moved. "All in favor of protecting Celeste?" Johnny called. 53 hands went up. Not a single dissent. "Motion carries." Johnny folded the note carefully. "We ride at 11:30 tomorrow. Full colors, best behavior. This isn't about intimidation. This is about protection. We're showing that little girl what real strength looks like, and we're teaching those bullies a lesson they'll never forget." But what Johnny didn't know yet was that Kyle Henderson's father had connections, and tomorrow's ride was about that. The next morning, Johnny stood in his bathroom and did something he hadn't done in months. He shaved carefully, trimmed his beard to perfection, made sure his Hells Angels vest was clean, the patches aligned, the leather conditioned. If they were going to an elementary school, he wanted to look like a professional. Dangerous, yes, but controlled, respectable. His wife, Sarah, 5'2", blonde, kindergarten teacher at a different school, watched him from the bedroom doorway. "You're really doing this?" "Damn right I am. The school's going to freak out. 50 bikers showing up, they'll probably call the police." "Let them." Johnny checked his reflection one last time. The tattoos on his neck were visible. No hiding those, but his eyes were clear and his expression was calm. That little girl asked for help. We're Americans. We help. Sarah smiled. The kind of smile that reminded Johnny why he'd married her 15 years ago. "You're a good man, Reaper. I'm a man who knows what it's like to be called a monster, and I'll be damned if I let a 6-year-old girl feel that way when I can stop it." At 11 a.m., the Anchorage Hells Angels assembled in the parking lot of their clubhouse. 53 riders. 53 Harley-Davidsons ranging from vintage shovelheads to brand-new Road Kings. Every bike polished to perfection, every rider in full colors. Some brought their wives riding pillion. Torch brought his 2 teenage daughters, both wearing Property of Hell's Angels support shirts. Tiny brought his son, a college kid, home for Thanksgiving break. This wasn't a gang, this was a family. Johnny addressed them before they mounted up. Rules are simple. We ride tight formation. No revving engines unnecessarily. We don't want to scare the kids more than necessary. We go to the cafeteria, we find Celeste, and we sit with her. That's it. Nobody starts trouble. Nobody threatens anyone. We're there to protect, not intimidate. Clear? Clear, the brothers responded in unison.
And remember, some of these kids are probably terrified of us. That's okay. Fear and respect are close cousins. But if any child shows genuine fear, you smile, you wave, you show them we're not the bad guys. We're the good guys who happen to ride Harleys and wear leather. Got it? Got it. Johnny climbed onto his bike, a 2019 Road Glide with custom paint that read Reaper across the tank. He kicked it to life, and the Milwaukee 8 engine roared. Behind him, 52 more engines joined in, creating a symphony of American-made thunder that echoed across Anchorage. They rolled out at 11:15, heading south toward Glacier Elementary. The ride through Anchorage was something residents would talk about for years. 53 Harleys in perfect formation, 2 by 2, stretching for blocks. Traffic stopped. People on sidewalks pulled out their phones. Kids pointed from car windows. The sound was overwhelming, pure mechanical thunder that announced the Brotherhood's arrival long before anyone could see them. They took Northern Lights Boulevard straight to the school, and as they approached, Johnny saw something that made his jaw tighten. News vans. Channel 2 and Channel 13, cameras already set up, reporters standing in the cold with microphones. Someone had tipped off the media. Johnny's phone buzzed. Text from Torch. Henderson's father called every news station in the city. Said we were threatening the school. Johnny smiled coldly. Good. Let them film this. Let all of Alaska see what happens when the Brotherhood protects the innocent. They pulled into Glacier Elementary's parking lot at exactly 11:30. The sound of 53 engines idling was like a physical force. Students pressed against classroom windows. Teachers stood in doorways, some scared, some confused, some, Johnny noticed, smiling. Principal Vickers came running out, his face red, his cheap suit flapping. "You can't be here. This is private property. I'm calling the police." Johnny killed his engine and dismounted. He was 6'4", 260 pounds of muscle and controlled fury. He walked slowly toward Vickers, who suddenly looked a lot less confident. "We're here for lunch," Johnny said calmly. "We were invited by a student, Celeste. You know her?" Vickers blinked. "The refugee girl? She invited you?" "She asked if I'd sit with her. So here I am, along with my family." Johnny gestured to the 50-plus bikers behind him. "We're not here to cause trouble. We're here to eat lunch with a little girl who eats alone every day while your students torment her. That a problem?" The news cameras were rolling. Vickers realized too late that sending away bikers who came to support a bullied refugee would look really bad on the 6 o'clock news. I'll need to verify this with Celeste," he stammered. "Good idea," Johnny said. "Let's go ask her together." The walk from the parking lot to the school's main entrance felt like a military operation, and in a way, it was. Johnny led the formation with Torch and Tiny flanking him. Behind them, 50 more bikers followed in perfect order, their boots crunching on the icy sidewalk. Nobody spoke. Nobody smiled. They were on a mission, and missions required focus. Principal Vickers walked ahead, practically shaking, occasionally glancing back at the army of leather and chrome following him. Teachers peeked out from classroom doors, eyes wide. Some looked terrified,
Others, especially the younger ones, the ones who maybe understood what was actually happening here, looked intrigued. They reached the cafeteria, and Vickers held up his hand. "Wait here. Let me talk to her first." "We'll wait," Johnny said. "But make it quick. Lunch period's already started." Through the cafeteria windows, Johnny could see the chaos inside. Kids were standing on benches, craning their necks to see what was happening. The cafeteria ladies had stopped serving food and were clustered by the kitchen window, whispering. And there, in the back corner near the emergency exit, sitting alone at a table meant for 12, was Celeste. She was eating carefully, her one hand managing a fork, her eyes down. She hadn't noticed the commotion yet. Or maybe she had and was pretending not to, the way kids do when they're used to being the center of negative attention. Johnny's chest tightened. She looked so small, so alone. Vickers disappeared inside, and through the windows, Johnny watched him approach Celeste's table, watched her look up, confused, watched Vickers lean down and say something, watched Celeste's expression shift from confusion to shock to something Johnny couldn't quite identify from this distance. Then she turned her wheelchair toward the cafeteria windows and saw them. 53 bikers standing in the cold, waiting for her permission to enter. Her hand flew to her mouth. For a terrible moment, Johnny thought maybe he'd made a mistake. Maybe this was too much. Maybe he'd terrified her instead of helping her. But then Celeste smiled, the first real smile Johnny had seen from her, and nodded so hard her whole body moved. Vickers returned, looking like he'd swallowed something sour. She says you can come in." "Appreciate that," Johnny said. He turned to his brothers. "Remember, best behavior. We're guests here." They entered the cafeteria in a wave of leather and denim and tattoos. The noise level, which had been building to a chaotic crescendo, dropped to absolute silence. 200 kids, ages 5 to 11, stopped mid-sentence and stared. Some of the younger ones looked scared. The older ones looked confused. A few, the ones who probably had bikers in their families, looked excited. Kyle Henderson, sitting at the popular kids' table near the windows, had gone pale. Johnny walked directly to Celeste's table, his brothers following. The little girl was gripping the edge of her wheelchair so hard her knuckles were white. Her eyes were huge, disbelieving, like she'd made a wish and couldn't believe it actually came true. Johnny crouched down to her level, the way he had in the parking lot yesterday. Up close, he could see she'd tried to brush her hair carefully today, had worn her nicest shirt, a pink thing with a unicorn on it. She'd dressed up for this. "Hey, Celeste, is this seat taken?" She shook her head, unable to speak. "Good." Johnny stood and pulled out the chair next to her. It was a small elementary school chair, and his huge frame looked ridiculous in it, but he didn't care. He sat down, and immediately Torch sat on Celeste's other side. Then Tiny, then Gus, then more brothers, until every seat at that table was filled with a Hell's Angel. The cafeteria was still silent. Every kid, every teacher, every adult present was watching this moment unfold. Johnny looked at Celeste. "You know what? I forgot my lunch. Think they got extra?" Celeste nodded, finally finding her voice. "They have pizza today. It's not very good." "Best pizza I ever had was in Naples, Italy, during a deployment," Torch said. "But you know what? I bet Alaska school pizza has its own charm." Tiny raised his hand toward the cafeteria ladies, who were still frozen by the serving window. "Ma'am, could we get some of that pizza? We're hungry." The spell broke. The cafeteria ladies